Hello everyone, today we talk about the Schmalkaldic War of 1546-47. We get to 16th century Germany. Last year we made a video about the German Peasants' War. This war was the armed culmination of a quarter century in which the Holy Roman Empire, this vast, largely decentralized polity comprising hundreds of semi-sovereign territories, here we're talking Germany, of course, Central Europe, nominally headed by an elected emperor, but in practice dominated by the 7 prince-electors and imperial estates, had drifted toward confessional and constitutional rupture without ever finding a mechanism to resolve it peacefully. There is an enormous history behind this, the one of the Reformation, of the reign of Charles V, of Habsburg. We talked in general about late medieval Germany, how essentially this country was still ruled in the early modern era. I made some videos about the Habsburgic possessions that are somehow, similarly ruled in a more compact way. So you can imagine in other parts of Germany to an extent, even though every place is really different and unique in its kind. We talked about the Habsburgic role as sort of imperial authority in Germany. We observed also the connections with Spain. We talked recently, and we will soon also, again, about the Italian wars. So it's a lot of stuff. The Schmalkaldic War is largely a regional war within Germany, and so it represents an exquisitely, let's say, a very at least political, of course, also confessional war, but political especially to the extent that religion had become, at this point, the discriminant between the plenitude of an empire that at this point, still in the first half of the 16th century, was, if not largely successful in an absolute sense, because Germany was mostly cavalcating the wave of the broader Habsburgic possessions. Mostly it was Spain and its sort of global empire at this point that had the lion's share as a war. But that could still, this was a moment in European history in which that would cyclically repeat, where the Habsburgs had the chance of united Germany before time, in a sense. Really few times, but it had happened since the 13th century and until the 18th, with also routine crisis that in a way, the same Schmalkaldic War represents. Because even though, I will not spoil, we must spoiler this, that the Habsburgs will be victorious in annihilating, as we will see now, the Schmalkaldic League through feats of arms, the mere fact that some participants, for example, Philip of Essen, had joined ranks of the enemies in that sense of the broader imperial policy, not just of the faith and of the Catholic Church, which was an enormous problem in and of itself already, and much more important than, in historical scale, the discovery of the Americas, left like a deep rift within Germany that in fact would not be fully resolved. Charles V, there was some sort of a humoral leader. He was in many ways a truly traditional knight. He was essentially a Flemish gentleman in upbringing, and he was melancholic. He suffered at some point greatly of depression, but he had still like this great dream in mind, in fact, of uniting Europe, right? Also in a properly Christian Catholic sense, to fight against the Ottoman, the Islamic threat at large, and restoring, therefore, like the Western empires, the tendentially hegemonic power in Western Eurasia, right? And this war was, in many ways, the measure by which in Germany this was not feasible anymore, regardless of victory, because, as you understand, with the curius regio eius religio, it will be affirmed later. Charles himself, that eventually abdicated voluntarily, leaving space to his son and brother, respectively, in Spain and in Germany, sort of left pretty bitter, bleak picture of the era that was, in fact, heading towards the Baroque, this moment in European soul where no point of reference exists anymore, right? There is a new world out there. There is the geocentric theory gradually substituted, challenged by the heliocentric one. There is the major, the greatest problem of the break of Christian unity in this confessional sectarian direction. And of course, the Holy Roman Emperor feels this very much, because even though we attributed, we say this very often for the Byzantines, in the West, we were always told, or we always told ourselves, that the Byzantine Empire was forever declining. It is not true. Whatever. What about the Habsburgs? Austria, even just as a power in general, does not get probably the due attention and recognition that it really deserves. And here it's not merely just about Austria, it's about probably the Holy Roman Empire that would last also quite some time. And in the 17th century you have things like the 30 Years' War. In the 18th you have probably the affirmation of the Austrian Empire at a regional scale. We also talked about this recently. So it's an incredibly important chapter in European history. But even more, say, 16th century Germany, at least at a smaller scale, requires this kind of attention. Now, the Diet of Worms in January-April 1521 had seen the 20-year-old Charles V, 1500-1558, so Habsburg ruler of an unprecedented composite monarchy that by the same 1521 already included Austria, the 17 provinces of the Netherlands, Castile, Aragon, Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and the rapidly expanding Spanish possessions in the Americas. Newly elected emperor, when, as he was very young, had to preside over on this occasion the condemnation of Martin Luther, 1483-1546, Augustinian friar and theology professor at the University of Wittenberg in Electoral Saxony, as a heretic and outlaw, as a matter of fact. As I told you, as anticipated, now we're doing a bit more special, including this one, but I'm actually I've already stored the first chapter, our manualistic modern contemporary history content that is really necessary to give this essentially military history some sort of more political, social backbone. We never really talk about the Reformation on Schwerpunkt. And I confess, of course, that there is some problem with that in discussing it, but acknowledging it to begin with, but it's mostly out of our other topics that are always valid in that sense, but that we will, in any case, have to widen exactly explaining this incredibly controversial, dramatic, tragic event in European history. We never even really made a video about the St. Charles V, that personally, as we anticipated before, is also a quite fascinating figure. Now, the edict promulgated in Charles' name banned Luther's person and writings throughout the empire, declared all who sheltered or followed him liable to the imperial ban, and stipulated that anyone convicted of supporting Lutheran ideas would forfeit all property and rights, half the confiscated goods going to the imperial treasury and half to the private accuser. The Habsburgs had been engineering higher forms, some institutions such as the Reichskammergericht, that was sort of the higher tribunal of the Holy Roman Empire, essentially mostly run by the Habsburgs as emperors, and that was an ever greater necessity in a quickly modernizing Germany, at least by the historical German pace. For that, we've seen also in some videos the spread of Roman law in Germany, the attempt of the Habsburgs at, in fact, securing an ever greater grip on this immense country that Germany was, that was bigger than today's Germany, or even just the sum of Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, modern countries, and that was incredibly variegated. Therefore, consider that the Netherlands were still part of the Kingdom of Germany at this point. We also made a video about the prodromes of the 80 Years' War. So we're not talking about the Ostsiedlung, so also the eastern German communities scattered far and wide in Central, even Eastern Europe. An incredibly complicated machine that we covered, especially in some depth in that series made last year about princely Germany. Naturally, the spread of a major heresy that could have also been sort of killed in the cradle, honestly, had sort of both sides behaved more acutely, like the papal legate, the same Luther. So it could have been avoided to an extent. That had old roots in any case. In the Protestantism is not anew really, as at least in many ways it's a product of its day and age, also this lens and so on. But some sort of the broader tendency of creating a schismatic, tendentially, I wouldn't say, gnostic, dualistic kind of distance from this denial of works value, the impossibility of saving yourself through at least what has been sort of commanded by the same God. So this is almost schizophrenia about what you're supposed to do and achieve regarding salvation in the world. We will talk also Luther in this traditionally critical lens at some point. I like to say this because if we can feel some sort of malaise today and discussing these topics, we can imagine what this was like in the 16th century, and especially in a Germany ridden by incredible conflicts, brutality. I think, again, the Peasants' War we've seen was the largest uprising in Europe before the French Revolution. It had been sort of put down. The same Luther had actually, he was the less of the extremists to an extent. Said, let's put down all these rabid dogs, largely, these largely being essentially Protestant, having those grievances against constituted order, imperial authority, etc. So Germany was an incredibly brutal and violent country at the time, even though it was as technologically advanced as Italy, and it had some of the most advanced levels of especially communal development by that point. And this federal spirit, this league's kind of codification in relation with the empire and so on, it was a country largely remaining in the Middle Ages still, and it will remain for centuries, including as far as violence was concerned. I made a video about German violence in the reign of Frederick II, and as we've seen also with these wars in the 16th, things had not really much changed. In fact, you can look at the German Peasants' War, even wars like these that had some also social implication. I'm talking the Schmalkaldic War. I mean, the first one, obviously more than just a social implication, were the tail strike of the great medieval civilization peasant uprisings, right? Germany, as other parts, also the north and the east of Europe, arrived later to that. And so this is not much a modern strife, it's something still deeply medieval. The enforcement of the measures against Lutheranism, however, required the active cooperation of the German princes and cities, because largely these were controlled the country as a whole. The Habsburgs had a good grip on some parts of Germany and beyond. They were the greatest power, but there were all this complicatedly thick heraldic prerogatives of the various local lords of the land, the various estates, and so on, that greatly complicated the entire political line. Charles left the empire in May 1521 for Spain, returning only in 1530 for his imperial coronation by the Pope in Bologna. This formality was still at this point incredibly loaded in meaning. As you know, Charles became emperor after his grandfather died, because his father had died young as Philip I of Spain. And he had collected, of course, like his inheritance, like dating to the Catholic monarchs of Spain, Isabel and Ferdinand. Indeed, places like the Alhambra that we recently made a video on, because just a few decades before that had been stripped from the Muslims as the golden apple, the melogrand, in fact, of Habsburgic iconography in this beautiful Renaissance paintings of the era, was exactly the best place to rule the world from. Also because Spain was, as we've seen also in the recent video about the El Gran Capitan, the greatest power at this point in Europe, especially after the Battle of Pavia, 1525, and also actually the bad things that happened also with the sack of Rome later at the hands of the same imperial soldiers. The Spaniards were apparently much more sort of violent, viciously violent, even than the Lutheran Landsknechten, which it's something you want to appreciate. It's sort of in general comparison of brutality. The Spanish didn't kid either, right? People at that point of militarized shepherds, largely after several hundred years of brutal struggle with the Muslims. Like, there is a reason also why they succeeded, largely succeeded in Italy, even against the French, that in any case failed largely during the Italian wars because they didn't want to arm the otherwise crushingly large, in fact, probably successfully effective amount of peasantry of the great Atlantic plains of Western Europe that could have, in fact, overrun those of the Spanish tercios. So in the 9 intervening years, and in most of the subsequent periods when Charles was again absent fighting France, the Ottoman Empire, North African corsairs, and we made multiple videos about, say, the Tunis expedition, the Algiers one, as well as the Turkish-French alliance shenanigans against the empire, the Lutheran Reformation spread virtually unchecked from its Saxon origins to Hesse. This was the famous Landgraviate in central Germany. Württemberg, the Duchy in the southwest, the Palatinate, the Electorate, Middle Rhine, Brandenburg, the Margraviate in the northeast that would later become the core of Prussia, Anhalt, a cluster of small principalities in central Germany, Pomerania, the Duchy on the Baltic coast, Braunschweig, Lüneburg, a large North German duchy divided into several branches, Nassau, a county west of the Rhine, Mecklenburg, a duchy on the Baltic, East Frisia county on the North Sea coast, and more than 60 imperial cities, freie Reichsstädte, that in theory were by their own constitution devoid of any other ruler between, in fact, them and the emperor. They were actually manipulated by other German princes. This list already gives you the idea of the complication of the picture, the fact that obviously everything that was more distant from the core of the Habsburgic possessions tended to be more autonomous. Most of these areas were actually also the least developed in Germany, so the ones that the same Habsburgs were not so interested after all in controlling. There were also many other problems all around. I made a video properly explaining the relative lack of immediate territorial threats. Yes, you can imagine the Ottomans besieging Vienna in the 1520s, and the same Landsknechten requiring a pretty large donative to sort of give the city back, otherwise, against properly threat of exterminated as the Turks would have liked to do. So these are the nice things that happen in Habsburgic possessions at large, but Constantinople is far. There are lots of different countries in between. That was really a top stretch like of the Ottoman momentum that in any case failed, and I have also pretty hefty series, as you know, about the 1683 siege. So always complicated story, because to make the same short, the Habsburgs were chronically out of money, and Germany, again, was a fairly rich country, but mostly because of its size, right? It had this very sort of prolific local particularism that allowed the same, for example, heretic ideas to spread relatively unchecked, and therefore allowed also certain development in the Third Estate and beyond. But it was an overwhelmingly agrarian, feudal country. The actors that we've seen here essentially embracing Lutheranism were doing so for exquisite political interest, right? There is no doubt that many of them actually believed and learned how to believe in this. Hell, even the French kings at some point wonder whether, given their Ottoman alliance and sort of general alignment of the papacy with the empire, would have not been convenient to convert to Calvinism. Instead, as we've seen also in the video about the French wars of religion, they rigorously stuck at the end of the day and as successfully with Catholicism. You understand immediately the difficulties that the spread of Lutheranism would provide for the government of Germany, because at that point it was a matter of creed, of conscience, of freedom of religion. This is what the Lutherans were essentially pointing at. The Reformation is big, right? And there is no doubt that it was founded essentially on a rejection of authority, of control. Again, there is no surprise that it spread mostly in the more peripheral and less developed areas of Germany to essentially get the worst ideology just to boost, however, as a mean, their local autonomies. Wherever a territorial ruler or city council introduced the new teaching, the secularization of bishoprics, monasteries, cathedral chapters, commanderies, and parish endowments followed almost automatically. This transferred immense landed wealth, jurisdictional rights, and fiscal income from ecclesiastical to secular hands, which you understand quite graphically what this actually means. It also permanently removed whole regions from the temporal authority of prince-bishops, that in Germany were quite powerful, who had either to be both spiritual and territorial lords. You have especially lots of medieval German history videos explaining why this was the case, especially in this part of Central Europe. Similar things will essentially happen in England. Again, everything can be transposed at a larger European scale. If you really look at where Protestantism spread first and most in Europe, it's mostly like fringe countries, Scandinavia, like countries that had lagged behind, as a matter of fact, that only now, actually, through this autonomization, began to, in fact, acquire more localistic substance, abandoning, in fact, the commitment to the greater Catholic cause, right, the great universal empire, which was definitely not a good thing for Europe, also considering that Protestants largely funded as well the Ottoman Empire against those who were on the first line with that. So mostly like the Germans, the Italians, mostly these. Also the Spanish were relatively distant. They wanted to control, of course, especially North Africa and Lithuania and so on. There were lots of other peoples, mostly in Central and Eastern Europe, that would pay the consequences of that directly and or indirectly. Now, the first attempt at collective Protestant self-defense in Germany had been the regional limited Thurgauer Bund of 1526-1529, which never became militarily active, however. Leagues in Germany were, as we just said, fairly common. It was a practice in moments of lawlessness and lack of central authority to institute some local Landfried self-defense pacification, essentially, which entailed essentially taking up arms, constituting new polities. At the end of the day, that's what the Swiss Confederacy, for example, was born like, as also one of the many leagues that were out there. There had been in Swabia, in the Rhineland, especially in these areas that were sometimes, like in this case, also very rich, right? Southern Germany, the Rhineland, these were very rich, but they also lacked political consistency. There wasn't any major power there, like in the east or even some part of the north, paradoxically. So that always remember, being particularly rich does not even necessarily mean to be politically united. Look at Italy, right? The battlefields in Southern Europe, in fact, were really signifying that, right? The most advanced country, essentially, in Europe, but prey, essentially, of foreign armies. Now, far more formidable was the Schmalkaldic League, formally constituted on February 27th, 1531. The name comes from the small Thuringian town of Schmalkalden, where this League was constituted after months of preparatory correspondence among the leading Protestant estates. Schmalkalden is a lovely town. Some parts, especially of central Germany, really maintain the old traditional vibe. Imagine how this could look even in the 16th century. Now, its founding members were Elector John Frederick I of Saxony, 1503-1554, of the Ernestine branch of the Wettin dynasty. We talked a bit about these families. These are famous houses in Germany, but the whole history of how they had come to be that, this splitting different lines, this was historically also the case for the Habsburgs, for the Wittelsbachs. At some point, you have everything in the medieval German playlist. We'll keep talking about that. And the Ernestine branch of the Wettin dynasty was the most important senior line, right? In fact, holding the electoral dignity since 1423. Then you have the Landgraf Philip I of Hesse, 1504-1567. This had been once also against Protestants, one of the greatest supporters of Charles V. The Habsburg really counted so much on this guy, and his defection to the Protestant cause would actually be this deep sort of embittering straw that would depress Charles further in his life, given all the existential chagrin deriving from this, the collapse especially of the German world in this confessional rivalries. Centrifugal forces. Philip was universally regarded as the most capable soldier among the Protestant princes. If you visit his tomb, like there's this beautiful slab he's showed in full armor. He was also the only one of all these leaders with significant campaigning experience, because normally the northern, the eastern German states, the ones who largely embraced Protestantism, were, as we explained, also the least powerful, right? The least modernized, like they will suffer that against Catholic forces still by the 30 Years' War. They had essentially just feudal armies. They fought like medieval forces against, in a world of pike and shot, that the Habsburgs themselves, with the Landsknecht and also with their scarce financial means, could boast in a country like Germany. Then there was the Duke Philip of Braunschweig-Grubenhagen, the Duke Ernst of Braunschweig-Lüneburg, Prince Wolfgang of Anhalt-Köthen, Count Wilhelm of Nassau-Dillenburg, and the representatives of 11 imperial cities, including Augsburg, major South German commercial center in the south. We've seen how important it was as a city for countering with its financially means banking resources, the repression of the German peasants that had rebelled largely, in fact, in Swabia in the south. So to show how also intricate, we say this part of Germany, that other, but Germany was inextricably entwined in all this, in geographically, estates, politically, in this religious division. You have Frankfurt am Main, the traditional coronation city of emperors as well. Ulm, also in the south. Strasbourg, here we're moving essentially towards the west, we're in Alsace. These were lands that had historically also coalesced into leagues. Kempten, Heilbronn, Memmingen, Lindau, Isny, Biberach, and later the fortress of Magdeburg, their episcopal see on the Elbe, Bremen, and Hamburg, and Hanseatic cities in the north. So it's a quite interesting bunch that also shows you, frankly, how opportunistic this alliance was. I mean, these were powers that at large had nothing to do with one another. Maritime republics, autonomous communes in the continent, on the opposite side of Germany, princes, some more powerful, some less, cities that had also had some more public official roles. So it's very complicated political geography in this whole. Now, the Schmalkaldic League's statutes explicitly define it as a defensive alliance. Right? Members bound themselves to aid one another with all their forces if any were attacked, quote, because of the word of God or otherwise on account of the present religious controversy. This was the norm for the Landfrieden in particular. It was the only obvious way to legal association, because essentially if the emperor was not able to impose order, right, security, the local subjects were traditionally allowed to coalesce and take matters in their own hands. But of course they could not simply move war across the empire. That was a public prerogative that the emperor had, and so it would have been preposterously unacceptable. Now, the League rapidly developed, however, a common treasury funded by fixed annual contributions, graded according to the wealth of each member, a war council that met several times a year, usually at Schmalkalden, Frankfurt, or Worms, standing military committees charged with recruitment, fortification, and the maintenance of arsenals, in a diplomatic network that extended to Denmark, then ruled by the pro-Lutheran Christian III, England, Henry VIII seeking allies against Charles V at that point, at least France, under Francis I eager to weaken the Habsburgs, and the Swiss cantons, especially Protestant Zurich and Bern, surely animated by the old hatred against the Habsburgic feudal rule. Charles V, almost continuously absent from the empire between 1521, but here by empire we mean Germany, we'll try actually to stick to that, in 1556, had been forced to grant concession after concession simply to obtain the Reichshilfe, that is the imperial aid in money and troops voted by the Diet he needed for his wider wars. Right? So you have almost a parallel organism to the already farraginous ones through which the emperor summons forces and exacts money in Germany, mostly for the sake also of the defense of the empire. That is also now radicalized, at least by a heretical ideology that is in and of itself essentially an excuse to go against the empire as well. The Diet of Speyer in 1526 suspended the Worms Edict pending a general council. Speyer was also sort of like the burial place of many historical emperors, so there is Habsburgic attempt there to restore order in a symbolic sense. Schmalkald could not quite boast much in tradition, whereas already Frankfurt and Worms had been historically very important and were now also hub, think about the same Worms, of heretical ideas. The second Diet of Speyer in 1529 attempted to reimpose the Worms Edict, provoking the famous protestation of 5 princes in 14 cities from which the term Protestant in fact derives. The Diet of Augsburg in 1530 received the Lutheran Augsburg Confession drafted by Philip Melanchthon, 1497-1560. This was notoriously Luther's closest collaborator and systematizer of Lutheran theology. And the Catholic Confutatio Augustana, composed by Johann Eck and Johannes Faber. Melanchthon's subsequent apology of the Augsburg Confession was rejected by Charles, but accepted and solemnly signed by League members at Schmalkalden in 1537 as their binding doctrinal standard. The Nuremberg religious peace of 1532 and the Frankfurt recess of 1539 effectively legalized the Protestant position until a final settlement could be reached. As you understand, it was a continuous back and forth, a bit like the Edict of Nantes will be in France. The empire could not simply accept, of course, in any case, the existence of a heresy, but could issue some tolerance on the basis, especially of autonomous and princely, in that sense, policy on the matter. That will be essentially the German policy until forever, because the principles were reaffirmed at the Treaty of Westphalia. So these repeated suspensions also allowed the League to consolidate, by the way, because the empire could not take at this point direct action against, say, simply half of Germany. And this, in fact, allowed the members to secularize enormous ecclesiastical wealth, which was, again, an enormous scandal at the time. It was an incredibly pressing issue, and again, the extent of lack of wealth and other priorities across Europe prevented Charles from taking action. And the Schmalkaldic League was also building military capacity that made open confrontation increasingly dangerous for the emperor himself. Now, from Charles' perspective, the religious division had become intolerable in any case. And you must really see this from the perspective of a Holy Roman Emperor of the era in a world where still Protestantism could be extinguished at some point. It's, say, in 40 years the Spanish Armada had succeeded. Likely today we wouldn't talk so much about Protestantism, if not as one of sort of other medieval heresies, as a matter of fact. As we will see now, so Charles did commit to the holy struggle. The emperor regarded the restoration of Catholic unity as essential to the sacred legitimacy of his own office, by the way, to the prestige of the universal Roman monarchy he had inherited from the medieval tradition, and to any realistic hope of transforming the empire from a loose confederation of semi-sovereign estates into a functioning state capable of holding its own against France and the Turks, the latter being probably the greatest dream of all. It's not like Germany did not lack the potential for this, but it would take centuries before that power could be fully unlocked. By 1544, the external situation changed radically. In fact, the Treaty of Crépy on September the 18th ended decades of war with France. By conceding Milan to Spain, as a government, by the way, because Milan kept remaining Holy Roman Imperial possession within the Kingdom of Italy, so not simply like a biased realm ruled by Spain on its own, like, I don't know, Naples or Sicily, right? This was very important. It shows you that the convergence, also the benefit that having, of course, both the Spanish monarchic and the Holy Roman Imperial crowns really entailed, as well as, by the way, abandoning French claims to Naples. That really shows how the French at this point had de facto lost the Italian wars. Then, yes, the Italian wars were not really fully over. They would also shift towards Flanders, and so things also would go on later. There was at this point also, in fact, a simultaneous truce concluded between the Empire and Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled between 1520 and 1566. The Ottoman Sultan at the height of his power, by the way, quietening the eastern front of the Habsburgic world, so to say. So for the first time since his election, Charles possessed both the freedom and the financial means, namely Spanish silver from the Indies, papal subsidies, these are actually very important, and the accumulated taxes of the Netherlands that sort of suffer the Habsburgic domination from their perspective, but were still not yet to fully rebel, to contemplate a military solution inside Germany. You want to appreciate in this sense what the landscape looks like, because it's still very medieval, right? The papacy obviously would always have a good reason to back the empire, and especially for it to put down heresies. More or less, Germany was kind of a unitary country, namely there was a kingdom. So even though there would be proper secessions, the Swiss were basically already on their own, but the Dutch were just yet like another province of Germany, essentially. Like, things can be handled, and as we will see now, the Habsburgs will really prove to be, a power to be reckoned with within Germany as well. Now, preparation was meticulous and deliberately disguised behind repeated public assurances of peaceful intent. At the Diet of Worms, January-May 1545, and the Diet of Regensburg, June 1545, June 1546, Charles promised new religious discussions that not of the matter. He urged Protestant participation in the Council of Trent, the most famous general council of the Catholic Church that opened in December 1545 in the Tyrolean city of Trent. That was, in the sense, part of the Kingdom of Germany, but from the southern side of the Alps, to enact the Counter-Reformation. That location had been quite meaningful as a point of junction between the German and the Italian wars, and so this, most importantly, rebel north, parts at least of its fringe, as we've seen, and the land of the papacy. The Council of Trent, as you know, is as important as the Reformation to a great extent. The Catholic Church was able to also look at itself, reform, to step up in new means of the propagation of the faith and more. This council had opened, in fact, the same year of the Diet of Regensburg, in December of 45. And Charles repeatedly essentially postponing all this, any final decision on enforcement of the Worms Edict, while privately negotiating binding alliances. On June the 7th, 1546, he concluded a treaty with Pope Paul III, Alessandro Farnese, who reigned between 1534 and 1549, that committed the papacy to 10,000 Italian foot, 500 horse for 4 months, 200,000 ducats immediately, and 100,000 ducats monthly thereafter. A pretty sizable force to support the emperor in Germany. The same day, Charles secured the benevolent neutrality of the neighboring Duke William IV of Bavaria, ruling 1508-1550. It was the head of the senior Wittelsbach line and staunch Catholic, as a matter of fact. Southern Germany, of course, is the richer, more civilized country, largely remains Catholic, and especially in the estates in charge. Bavaria would provide also magazines, quarters, roads, bridges, and safe passage in exchange for territorial concessions in the Salzburg and Würzburg regions. They're a bit scattered. I mean, Salzburg is naturally closer to Bavaria, but Würzburg is further north. And even a possible future claim on the Palatine electoral dignity, which was something that, as we've seen, the Wittelsbachs were already involved with, as a matter of fact, from a while. The marriage of a Bavarian prince to a daughter of King Ferdinand, 1503-1564. As you know, Charles V's younger brother, King of the Romans since 1531, and ruler of the Austrian hereditary lands. Charles provided his son with the greater, more important part of the Habsburgic inheritance, that is Spain, including the Netherlands, that is also like the poem of discord in a sense, like in hindsight, but you also have to understand this from the perspective of the year. On the 19th of June came the master stroke, a treaty with the Duke Maurice of Saxony, 1521-1553, the Protestant head of the Albertine Wettin line, a junior branch of the Saxon house, ruling the ducal lands around Dresden. All right, so this was quite relevant because you could essentially split Saxony as a whole, as it already was between these branches, the Ernestines and the Albertine of the Wettin house. Maurice had always refused to join the League, hoping, in fact, to contrast his relative of the other branch that at that point had more power and therefore could sort of press the Albertine one. In fact, the same Maurice coveted the electoral dignity held by his Ernestine cousins, and you understand why he would make a deal with Charles. You also understand, by the way, how geopolitics never means anything, and it's just, a pretty bad heresy, as a matter of fact, itself, as these powers were able just a few tens of kilometers of distance to clash against one another, receiving in the moment the support of this or that power near or far, whatever. This is a symptom, of course, of great political instability, fluidity, malleability. This is exactly what Charles is making leverage on himself. He knows he is the more powerful side. That doesn't provide you with victory in an automatic sense, but definitely the Schmalkaldic League was, to an extent, the dimension of paranoia against imperial rule, envy against the Habsburgs, and more. Now, Maurice pledged neutrality and active assistance in enforcing any imperial ban. In return, he received immediate protection and jurisdiction over the rich bishoprics of Magdeburg and Halberstadt, and the unmistakable, though carefully unwritten, prospect that the Saxon electoral dignity would pass from the Ernestine to the Albertine line if John Frederick were defeated. So say, this is the boat, go get it. And it's also very interesting to see that, of course, even in these Protestant parts of Germany, it's not like every single bishopric had been dismantled. Germany had a pretty strong sense of hierarchies and dignities, so you couldn't simply go at specific ecclesiastical lords, and there was always this idea, okay, well, more than else, there is going to be a lay prince that will protect you, will provide you with the means to rule your territory, mostly just as a protection in exchange for hash money, so some gradual integration of these ecclesiastical principalities into some more lay dominions, even though there were wide ecclesiastical states that would not be secularized, in fact, until the era of Napoleon. So this tells you so much about what Germany actually was at the time, like a very intricate mess. Similar agreements, by the way, were reached with other Protestant princes of secondary rank that could help. For example, Margrave Hans of Brandenburg-Köstrin, the Duke Erich of Braunschweig-Kallenberg, and Margrave Albrecht Alcibiades of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, notorious mercenary captain and freebooter, by the way, which could always turn even more useful in this case. You see also how many different branches of bigger power, because these were all private houses historically, so all the various branches had always kind of existed. This is not like, the Albertine, the Ernestine line that were almost sort of the same scale. There were many other sort of minor noblemen also from great houses. Like in this case, Brandenburg, for example. Now, and they were largely knights, warriors, professional soldiers, veritable mercenaries by vocation. We've largely discussed this because here we are in an age, again, of still medieval nature, but this also will gradually become the backbone of the officialty of the increasingly modernizing armies of the later centuries, as they were the most military experienced elements of the establishment. Now, the League leaders were fully aware of the gathering storm by this point. You can't really hide it. On July the 4th, 1546, John Frederick and Philip met secretly with their counselors at Ichterhausen in Thuringia. They calculated that Charles could ultimately raise a far larger army, thanks to Spanish silver, papal gold, and Bavarian logistics, as we've seen, but that at the exact moment the emperor's mercenaries were still scattered across Italy, the Netherlands, Hungary, and the Rhineland. Right? These were all areas where the Landsknechten had been stationed to maintain order, more or less. I made a pretty large video years ago about Landsknecht, and we will surely come back on that. They're quite of an interesting professional force, right? A bit like in this case, a tail strike of medieval rather than modern military professionals. In fact, by the end of the 16th century, their fame and reputation had eroded as much just as the consistency of their estate. They were considered properly as an estate. They were gradually corrupted and rendered efficient by their union leaders, so to say. And Germany sort of surpassed that model as well. But there was a strong sense of redemption from these largely forestaters, armed since the time of Maximilian, to get probably a higher status in the imperial hierarchy. Unruly but brutally effective, they sort of helped the Habsburgic monarchy more than once. A swift preventive offensive, the Schmalkaldic leaders concluded, offered the only realistic chance of victory. In other words, if the Landsknechten were all scattered across the empire, across the Alps even, if the Schmalkaldic force had sort of began to take them out in detail before the Habsburgs could react and recompact forces, had they made the first move, a preemptive attack basically, there would have been greater chances of success against the emperor, right? Martin Luther's death on February 18th, 1546 had removed, by the way, the most authoritative voice insisting that armed resistance to the emperor was theologically impermissible except against a manifest tyrant of the Beowulf variety, which is a terrible werewolf that mostly also Luther's description looked like the rowdy peasants that had been put down like dirty animals in the previous generation, rather than in the respectable imperial authority. Now, the League Council, therefore, at this point, was resolved on war. There were much more radical Protestant agitators that definitely knew how to spirit and galvanize forces. However, it still was a matter of princes, as always in Germany. Consider that within the same etymology of the term Landsknechten, there is the concept properly of servant, right? Servant of the emperor, but understood here as properly in the German sense of none free of bonded with a master, right? The Landsknechten were to serve their country, but they were doing that as they had been a chance by an enlightened elite, so to say. And they were forestaters, thus also despised by the nobility. And so an army of ogres, so to say, against the sort of shinier nobility, at this point, commanded by the emperor as the ultimate Sauron in the perspective, at least of these rebels, that were actually, that the relations are somehow inverted, like also from a theological point of view in reality. But there was surely a contempt. What I mean is this, by this high nobleman of Germany against imperial servants fighting for Charles V. What is this, right? We have our own followers, we have our own retinues. Those guys are just unchained devils that want to oppress and suppress us and bring everything under the control of a single man, which at this point Germany was not sympathizing for, unlike it will do in 1933 for that matter. But again, at different levels, not necessarily for better or for worse. It really depends on different aspects and different contexts. Now, hostilities opened in Swabia with startling speed, given the Schmalkaldic strategy. Within a week, Sebastian Schertlin von Württemberg, 1496-1577, the Augsburg-born mercenary captain and the League's most aggressive, at least field commander, had assembled 12,000 men from the upper German cities and on July the 10th, 1546, seized the episcopal city of Füssen on the Lech River. So we're in southern Germany, notoriously enough. Schertlin's plan was to thrust southward, in fact, through the Fernpass and occupy the main Alpine routes, thereby preventing the junction of Italian papal and Netherlandish contingents with Charles's main force. This was a clever move. Also, the German peasant revolt, as we've seen, depended largely on the fact that the emperor that was the year of the campaign of Pavia, the first of the imperial invasion of Provence. Then the war brought back to Italy with the French counteroffensive. Here we are in a similar situation, because not just like the rebels, we can say, did not were to act before any reinforcement came from the south, but they had the capacity at this point to block properly an important part of the Alpine passes. Not all of them, even. The situation is also internationally complicated, partially we will see it now. Now, the Schmalkaldic League Council, terrified of turning the still neutral Archduke Ferdinand of Austria into an active enemy, because, of course, Ferdinand had historically his own autonomy, categorically forbade the move, however. All right, so it would have been strategically very feasible, so the hell with politics. This is, of course, what a mercenary captain is mostly concerned with, because at the end of the day, he's not calling the shot himself, right? What does he have to lose? He already, plays with death, lurking in the shadows, as in the beautiful incisions of Albrecht Dürer of this era. Now, in the north, some 16,000 foot and 5,000 horse gathered, however, in Thuringia, under Saxon command. Look at the composition, very medieval, all right, some 1-3 cavalry infantry ratio. This was truly still, especially in the north, a medieval country. Charles, at that moment, had barely 1,000 men with him on the upper Danube. Definitely not a great situation. Doesn't matter if you have some geographic barrier here and there. With 1,000 men, you're not going that far. However, at this point, the neutrality declarations of both Bavaria and Austria gave him the weeks he needed. This presents naturally also a problem for the same Schmalkaldic leaders that have to take the step of probably going at war with a wall system, rather than making it just a matter of defiance against the emperor. Now, by late summer, Charles's host had swollen to approximately 52 combatants of 4 nationalities, namely 20,000 Germans, 12,000 Italians, 10,000 Spaniards, and 10,000 Netherlanders, under the overall command of Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, the famous Duke of Alba, 1507-1582, Charles V's most trusted general and future governor of the Netherlands. Right, we'll continue our series about the 80 Years of War soon. With the veteran tercios of Lombardy, Naples, and Hungary. These were the famous Spanish and not only Spanish infantry formations of pike and arquebus that dominated the European battlefields for more than a century, as we've seen with the inception, at least, pike and shot tactics, probably within the Spanish army with Fernandez Gonzalo de Cordoba. And these were probably the elite core of the army, by the way, for different reasons. But in any case, also imperial forces largely at this point depended on Spanish military gold standard, so to say. The same Landsknechten in their flamboyant appearance actually drew from Spanish fashion. Interestingly enough, we've seen this in the video about the Landsknechten dress, also the Catholic German dress, because there is also up to the 30 Years War some pretty distinctive fashion in that sense. In late July, the northern and southern Protestant armies effected a junction near Donauwörth, momentarily giving the League perhaps 50,000 foot and 7,000 horse against an imperial army still incomplete. You understand that the armies are actually very similar in number, not just in scale. They're really big forces. This is a massive showdown, and it is the result of decades of mounting tensions, ideological divide, right, fundamentalistic radicalization, and much more, like in this dramatic confessional clash. Landgrave Philip, the League's most experienced soldiers, as we've seen repeatedly, demanded a decisive battle to get it over with, also because the cost of this force was crushing, to say the least. For German standards, having more than 100,000 men in arms was something overbearingly expensive. And the League was not the most favored from that side, by the way, especially when Charles demonstrated he could wait and remain, for example, in the defensive by entrenching himself behind the Danube fortress of Ingolstadt with the river at his back. By the way, Donauwörth, here we've seen some of the same battlefields in the video about Blenheim, right, for Marlborough, but that, give it just a couple of 100 years. Now, the League commanders recoiled from assaulting prepared positions and from violating Bavarian neutrality by outflanking the Imperial army across Bavarian soil, however, because directly attacking the emperor was not just risky, but it would have politically triggered a much stronger reaction across Germany and sort of, in this sense, summoning much greater enemy forces. Paradoxically, instead, crossing one of these princes' lands was not seen as aggressive. Weeks were lost in the process. This tells you, however, how sort of pressed the Schmalkaldic League was at this point, but also the real sort of the weaker side to an extent. In any case, the offensive is definitely the most demanding of the sides in war. In mid-September, Maximilian van Egmond arrived with 17,000 Netherlanders, restoring rough parity. By the way, the Imperials now took the offensive, confident in, if anything, the quality of their forces, advancing toward Nördlingen, other famous name, especially in the following century. The League shadowed these forces, but again refused battle. By mid-October, disease stalked the Imperial camp at Gingen and the Brenz, while the Protestant armies were paralyzed by lack of pay, was already starting being felt, and also the first autumn rains. This enormous army, like in the German fall, is not really the best, especially in these territories that are still, again, like not particularly well served infrastructurally for such a large army. The mortal blow, however, fell from Saxony. Remember the deal that Charles had brokered with Maurice of the Albertine line. In October, Maurice, in fact, and Bohemian troops under Sebastian von Weidmühl invaded the almost undefended Ernestine lands, occupying Zwickau and most of the Vogtland, while Bohemian forces took Plauen. In other times in history, we've seen it, the series about Markfeld, also the times of Charles IV. Also, especially think about Wallenstein during the 30 Years' War. Like, attacking northern Germany from Bohemia is naturally easier to the extent, of course, there is a force there that can launch this attack. While, in fact, northern Protestant forces, the same picture, with Gustavus Adolphus would reach the south of Germany in an offensive posture. John Frederick and Philip quarreled bitterly for weeks. At this point, Philip insisting that the emperor in the south must be crushed first. John Frederick refusing to abandon his hereditary territories, and especially this army, mostly summoned from the north, just like at the time of Wallenstein and Gustavus Adolphus, being in serious risk of having its already precarious logistical lines cut off by the Saxons and the Bohemians. Now, on November the 16th, the Elector finally marched north with the bulk of his Saxon forces. The remaining League army in Swabia, as a consequence, simply dissolved almost overnight for want of funds. Charles secured thus southern Germany virtually without striking another blow. Duke Ulrich of Württemberg and Elector Palatine Frederick II signed capitulations before Christmas 1546 that obliged them, by the way, to heavy payments and symbolic humiliations. Most upper German cities followed. The south of Germany is cleared, basically. 2 envoys from Ulm were made to kneel for half an hour before the emperor begging forgiveness. Right? Imagine just like the humiliation in general, the coast, the public display. This was also how, very medievally speaking, like public official relations were sort of affirmed in front of everyone, the notables. Only the city of Constance continued resistance, finally stormed in October 1548 and stripped of its imperial immediacy. In Saxony, the winter of 1546-1547, by the way, saw a remarkable Ernestine recovery. However, John Frederick, returning hurriedly from the south, expelled the invaders from Thuringia, occupied Halle on December the 31st, and from January the 6th to the 27th of 1547 laid siege to Leipzig, which Maurice had garrisoned with 10 companies. The siege failed, but the besiegers financed themselves by melting down cathedral silver from Merseburg into emergency, quote, Leipziger Klippen coinage of silver and gold. Wilhelm von Domsherrn raided Bohemian mining towns such as Elbogen and Komotau. Markgraf Albrecht Alcibiades of Brandenburg-Kulmbach, who had joined the Imperial side, was himself captured on February 25th, 1547. The Ernestine war chest was empty at this point, and no significant Bohemian Protestant rising occurred, for example. So there was some reversal in the north of the situation, but also nothing clamorous. At this point, Charles delayed his own entry into the theater until he judged the moment perfect. On March the 28th, 1547, the emperor left Nuremberg and united near Eger with the forces of Ferdinand and Maurice, creating a combined army of perhaps 27,000. Here we are next also to Bohemia. It's a quite strategic corner land from which different directions to be taken are possible. John Frederick, with barely 7,000 men, withdrew northward along the left bank of the Elbe toward the great fortified triangle of Wittenberg, Torgau, Muhlberg, and the latter already rings a bell, hoping the river in spring flood would protect his flank. Imagine again these areas of northern Germany in the mid-16th century, still relatively marshy. Remember, these are the lands of the sort of rough, let's say, descendants of the wars of the Teutoburg forests, or right around there. Now, on the evening, April the 23rd, John Frederick camped on the Lochauer Heide, just north of Muhlberg. That is a heath in this sort of flatland, just north of Muhlberg, convinced the Elbe was impassable there. He posted only light guards and allowed many officers to attend evening service even. At first light on April 24th, a thick fog lay on the river. Guided by local peasant, Spanish and Italian veterans discovered a little-known ford. Others swam across and silenced the Saxon pickets. A pontoon bridge the Saxons had neglected to destroy was seized intact. In other words, the Protestants did not realize what was happening, the risk they were running, and the more experienced imperial forces that had been on their tail began to take advantage of the situation. Alba's heavy cavalry, we're talking about Neapolitan men-at-arms, Spanish jinetes, Hungarian hussars, poured over, on the Heide, right, followed by the tercios of Lombardy, Naples, and Hungary. Taken utterly by surprise, John Frederick ordered an immediate retreat, but his army had no time to form. Hastily deploying along a woodland edge to avoid encirclement, the Saxons were shattered by simultaneous cavalry charges on both wings, Alba commanding the heavier right, Maurice the left, while the Tercio infantry advanced irresistibly in the center. A great display of combined armed tacticals, showing like the collective effectiveness of this multinational force. Admittedly, the greater feat was taking the Saxons by surprise. Here they barely had any time to deploy, but in general there was also a substantial difference in force and training in general. John Frederick fought in the front rank until a saber cut to the face half blinded him with blood. Surrounded in a small wood near Falkenberg, he was taken by Spanish and Hungarian troopers and led first to Alba, then to the emperor himself. The outcome was disastrous for the Protestants. The Battle of Mühlberg annihilated the last field army of the Schmalkaldic League. On May the 19th, 1547, under sentence of death, John Frederick signed the capitulation of Wittenberg. This tells you how much imperial authority was to be restored in Charles' view, and an admonishment really towards all princes as well. Because here, as we've seen also with Philip of Hessen, you could not really know who would sort of turn against you. So even some of the most faithful, some of the best of the German princes. Now, 2 northern episodes prolonged the war's dying gasps, by the way. It wasn't simply over in this mess. The imperial city of Bremen had been under siege since January 1547 by 12,000 men under the 19-year-old Duke Erich II of Kallenberg and the mercenary colonel Christoph von Wriersberg. When a Protestant relief column, originally detached by John Frederick before Muhlberg, by the way, subsequently reinforced by contingents from Brunswick, Hildesheim, Hamburg, and Magdeburg, marched north plundering Kallenberg. Erich, due to the care for his possessions, abandoned the siege. And you understand how easily you could target. You see how really, war is a continuation of politics with other means here. Where on May the 22nd, Erich hurried south to protect his lands. On May the 23rd, near Drakenburg, his 6,000 to 7,000 men occupied a chain of high sand dunes east of the Weser River, believing the position impregnable, with 17 cannon commanding open fields and the wind and sun at their backs, by the way. The Protestant force of roughly equal size, guided by the local captain Brun von Bothmer, executed a classic double envelopment, exactly to go past this frontal bastion. The main body attacked frontally, yes, to pin the enemy center down, while 1,000 mounted arquebusiers with light guns swung wide and struck the Imperial rear from concealed northern approaches. Erich's array disintegrated as a consequence. His cavalry fled through his own infantry. Escape routes were sealed by marsh in the flooded Weser, and perhaps 2,500 Imperial troops were killed or drowned in the process. The same Erich barely escaped by swimming the river. Wriersberg's lagging column, by the way, arrived too late, retreated northward, and later surprised the Protestant baggage train near Hassel, capturing 100,000 gulden. But the imperial cause in northern Germany was finished by this engagement. We also appreciate how the Reiter are essentially, let's say, rising at this point. Here we're exactly like in the mid-16th century. This is the peak of pike capacity. Cavalry is reduced mostly to the skirmishing roles. It's never fully abandoning, of course, its charging capacities. But here, like in this wilder northern German environment, you realize that a relatively smaller force, see, the smaller the forces in general involved in combat, the more, let's say, unpredictable the outcome, right? Strange things can happen. In this case, the Protestants were good, and they exploited the mobility and firepower of the Reiter to outflank and shatter both physically but primarily psychologically the enemy, crushing a well entrenched like pike shot also in cannon position. Like so, this is a very interesting lessons to be taught regarding, of course, also again a smaller engagement that was, however, by northern German standards of power availability in loco enough for still sort of amputating a little bit the imperial success during this campaign. The Schmalkaldic League ceased to exist anyway. At this point, really the entire idea after the shattering delivered by Charles was enough to sort of disband it. The main leaders of sin had been defeated, humiliated. The emperor, believing himself master of Germany carried the captive princes in his train from Augsburg to Brussels and back, displaying them as trophies in the Netherlands. This is also, again, you see how dark and bitter this whole scenario really is. Like it's really like in a Dürer's incision there. At the so-called Armored Diet of Augsburg in 1548, Charles imposed the Augsburg Interim. That is a compromised liturgy and discipline intended to serve as a bridge back to full Catholic unity. He couldn't quite just push full Catholicism on the Protestants of Germany. Thus, when you really look even at this Habsburgic success of the war, this Schmalkaldic League, you realize that things had not really changed overall too much, especially in terms of religious policy. The interim issued at Augsburg satisfied neither side and alienated actually moderate Catholics as well. Within 3 years, Maurice of Saxony, fearing Charles' plans to make the empire a hereditary Habsburgic monarchy and outraged at the continued imprisonment of his father-in-law Philip, that somehow stained his own house, regardless of the branch, secretly negotiated with France and other princes. In spring 1552, he struck, forcing Charles to flee Innsbruck in nightshirt and slippers, by the way. This is a bit of another chapter, but say the Treaty of Passau in August 1552 was signed, releasing John Frederick and Philip, and suspended the interim as well. So, very interesting unfolding. Final settlement came only with the more famous religious peace of Augsburg in September 1555 under Ferdinand I, which recognized Lutheranism as a legal confession and established the normative principle cuius regio eius religio, thereby closing the first great armed confessional confrontation within the Holy Roman Empire. You have really to wait for the 30 Years' War for the matter to be reissued in a sort of very different, in part, but also in other part, sort of similar scenario. And so you understand this back and forth. At that point, Charles was, he had abdicated. He still controlled essentially politics. So Ferdinand naturally wanted to be a bit like the emperor of the situation. He was actually much better as a Spanish ruler, instead, like it was mostly his brother. It was instead more like a Burgundian knight that ended up ruling. There's a complicated story and relation between brothers as well. But you understand the sort of, again, the darkness of the times, the betrayal, the instability, the sense that everybody at some point is defecting anyway. So imagine all the efforts, all the pressure, fighting this war and so on, and realizing at the end of the day that yes, this was an Habsburgic success. It could have gone worse. A major threat had been averted, but still, again, this was the problem, that Germany was this hydra of many heads that you couldn't quite simply tame, even though it remained for this reason ungovernable, right, and continuously unstable, in a precarious situation, also sort of preventing the empire from enacting more successful policies in the rest of the continent and so on. So very, very delicate and sort of dramatic situation. At the same time, it really gives you the picture of an era. I'm glad we talked more about Charles V, because we never really made similar videos. Today we didn't even talk about him too much, right? But we started some series here and there to talk properly about his role, what was happening also with the Ottoman side, the age of Francis I, Suleiman, Belgrade, Rhodes, Moab, and so on. Muhlberg, great Catholic victory, was a triumph for the emperor. At the same time, the cuius regio eius religio was the sanctioning of essentially an unchanged, immutable situation. And this, again, also in the broader picture, as you've seen, Charles wasn't in Germany for most of his reign. So there were also more important things too. In part, the reason why the Schmalkaldic League was born and managed to gain all that momentum was in part due to the fact that it was probably underplayed, like underrated by imperial authority, and this because they could it could wait for this matters, but exactly for this emboldened the rebels even more. So it's an incredibly messed up and difficult mechanism that we already illustrated in the video about the German peasants' revolt. It was something even more, that was really ill-fated. Here, the thing was mostly nobiliarly led, also at the time to an extent, but let's say this violent forces suddenly emerging from Germany without even much of a control and a consistency, but still giving this ponderous blows to sort of imperial authority, regardless of the fact that at the end of the day, the Habsburgs did maintain this, a bit like during the 30 Years' War. At the end of the day, sort of the situation remained the same. That was kind of the goal of the Protestants, if we're looking at these confessional clashes, so that you can't even say that you see in perspective, like who did actually win the 30 years, who did lose that, right? There is this myth that sort of Protestant power simply affirmed themselves. Yes, because the system was collapsing, right? About, say, under everybody's feet. So the idea of a universal rule was essentially evaporating together with tradition. And so rather than a victory in absolute sense, it was a victory in relative sense, right? For those countries who managed to become more powerful. But most cases, aside from even some of the apparently least relevant, such as Brandenburg, at least not entirely, but since the end of the Middle Ages, there were, and even before, they were actually very important. But you see very few players eventually emerged out of Germany as capable of going anywhere as independent powers. So one really wonders how, history, what kind of path history takes, especially considering the German Sonderweg. There is definitely besonders in undoubtedly, but it's also quite, complicated and difficult, to say the least, right? So I'm giving you all these, they're not teasers because we talked about these topics always in relatively complete terms, right? But they're also general introductions, say a good, beautiful video about the Battle of Muhlberg at some point, tactically wise. Today we just said something here and there because we are looking at the broader picture. We need videos of this kind, but we also need much more in-depth stuff. And I'm working for that. We also have to cover more modern battles for sure, and doing so many other things altogether. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.